Hi.
Good day. Ray Franz going into the history of the development of the thought that somehow the door-to-door ministry sets apart God's people in the latter days. That's never been the thought of the church over the centuries. Public ministry will address that. What form does public ministry take in the New Testament itself? In several videos to come. And at the end of this one, because Rutherford's participation or non-participation in this work is mentioned. So, under the heading Earlier History, on page 190 of In Search of Christian Freedom, Ray begins, "The evidence is that combined factors of mass production and mass distribution of literature played a major role in the emergence of this activity as the outstanding feature in the organization's program of works. During the presidency of the movement's founder, Charles Taze Russell, the printing of all Watchtower literature was done by outside printing firms. For the first 4 decades of the organization's history, literature distribution was done largely by some individuals, giving out free tracts, often in front of churches on Sundays, and by a limited number of coal porters who received the literature at discount rates and sold it from door to door or in whatever way they might choose."
Early in the presidency of J.F. Judge Rutherford, the organization set up its own printing establishment. From that time onward, the Watchtower Society gave increased emphasis to field service activity, in going from door to door, offering literature to the public. None is distributed through bookstores where people seek books through personal initiative. In his Watchtower-sponsored book, Faith on the March, A.H. Macmillan, a headquarters staff member actively associated with the movement from the turn of the century, described the changed approach that developed, saying,
Direct quote here, "Russell had left it much to the individual as to how we were to fulfill our responsibilities. Rutherford wanted to unify the preaching work, and instead of having each individual give his own opinion and tell what he thought was right and do what it was in his own mind, gradually Rutherford himself began to be the main spokesman for the organization. That was the way he thought the message could best be given without contradiction. At the same time, we began to realize that each one of us had a responsibility to go from house to house and preach. We were shown that it was a covenant-keeping arrangement. We had a duty to God, as well as a privilege and duty to our fellow men, to see that they were informed of God's purposes. God's favor and approval was not to be won by developing character." That a reference, of course, to the tendency in Russell's era to stress character development. In 1927, we were shown that the way each individual was to serve was to go from door to door. Sunday especially was stressed as the most opportune day to find people at home. That's the end of the quote from Faith on the March by A.H. Macmillan.
So back to Ray. Individual thinking and expressing as to fulfilling our responsibilities to God thus began to be depreciated, taking on a negative connotation, and organizational conformity was stressed as meritorious. The duty of the individual, a duty owed to God, and the way to serve was clearly laid out. It was to go from door to door with the Watchtower's literature. Watchtower associates, not yet known as Jehovah's Witnesses, a name first applied in 1931, soon began referring to such door-to-door activity as service, for that was the way to serve God. The term was always understood in this way. If used in another sense, it was qualified, as in referring to a baptismal service. But by itself, service, at that time, always related to door-to-door work, not to any other activity related to their worship. Under the organization's direction, it indeed had become the preeminent way for them to serve God. The Watchtower associate who, on a Sunday morning, spent an hour or more in such door-to-door activity returned home with the feeling of having done his duty, his service to God, at least for that week.
Rutherford, before becoming part of the Bible student, that is, Watchtower movement, had shown interest in political activity. The effect of that background can probably be seen in some of the terminology that developed. We have already seen that he placed strong emphasis on organization, so that this term came to replace the scriptural term congregation when referring to the worldwide community of witnesses, while individual congregations were called companies. But more significantly, it may be seen in his developing such terms as campaigns to refer to special witnessing activities at certain designated periods, in which campaigns, in some cases called divisional campaigns, large numbers were urged to participate and thus contribute to the impressiveness of the advertising of the message proclaimed. The monthly field service instruction sheet was called the bulletin. Those participating in the activity were called class workers, later publishers, and pioneers, and were assigned territories to be covered. Groups of publishers worked under the direction of a field service captain.
There is no evidence that Rutherford himself took any part in this door-to-door work. Based on expressions made by my uncle, Franz, and others who were headquarters members during Rutherford's presidency, it appears that when inquiry was made about this, the answer given was that his responsibilities as president did not permit his engaging in this activity. Thus he could at best say, "Do as I say." He could not say, "Do as I do." The book Jehovah's Witnesses in the Divine Purpose shows that in 1920 something new was introduced to heighten the focus now placed on this work. The quote is, "The tightening up of the preaching responsibility began in 1920 when everyone in the congregation who participated in the witness work was required to turn in a weekly report."
The time intervals for reporting thereafter varied from weekly to monthly to semi-monthly, but the stress laid on the door-to-door preaching activity, once begun, continued to grow, along with the related emphasis on organizational conformity and uniformity of thinking and action. The stress on door-to-door activity and on turning in a report of such is a major legacy of Rutherford's presidency that has remained to this day. Very interesting that Ray makes a side glance at Rutherford's hypocrisy in this manner, that he initiates this great worldwide advertise the kingdom around 1919, 1920, but he himself never participates, and Franz excuses this, or at least says that J.F. Rutherford excused it as, well, the office of president doesn't permit me to engage in these kind of activities. Well, again, the contrast with the first century.
Yeah, that's what came to mind, because the only ones that were the leaders were the ones that did most of the talking. They were the ones that were speaking out on occasions. And usually it was in big groups, like crowds of people around them. Then they would stand up and they would defend the faith or preach.
Yeah, look at the accounts we have in the book of Acts, where you have lengthy excerpts, sometimes, of messages that were given by apostles, but not always by apostles, but never by what we would call publishers or disciples.
Yeah.
We have Peter, we have Paul and Barnabas, we have
John,
Stephen. We have examples of their messages, but all of them were incidental, or you might say accidental to their situations. For instance, Peter, at Pentecost, when the Spirit falls on the congregation, he's explaining to the crowd that gathered on that occasion what this means. Yeah. It's not he went somewhere to preach.
And the two going up to the temple, going up to worship, and then are stopped, and that's when they start speaking.
They're stopped because they performed a miracle on a man who they didn't even know was there.
Yeah.
And that causes a crowd to gather. And that causes them to be arrested, and then we have a record of their speech to the crowd and then to the Sanhedrin after they're arrested.
And Stephen, we know, was primarily taking care of people, but then he's arrested, and that's when he gives his speech.
And
Again, to
The
a group of people, not at the door.
Yeah, he's arrested, and the speech we have, the longest speech in the book of Acts, but by a non-apostle at that, is the account of his speech in the Sanhedrin, which causes, of course, his death. And then later on, you do have Paul being grabbed in the Areopagus in Athens in Acts 17, and another occasion where they heal a man and they're taken to be gods in an unsophisticated pagan environment, Acts 14. You do have an example of Paul actually going somewhere to preach, but when he goes somewhere to preach with Barnabas in Acts 13, it's a synagogue. Again, a public place.
Yeah, and then he hires or rents a building and lets the people come to him.
That's in Acts 19 and 20.
You never see them standing on a doorstep talking to people.
So interestingly, the very text the Watchtower uses, let's say Acts 20:20, about how Paul taught publicly and from house to house, he's talking to elders. He's talking about work he did within the congregation context, never about the way he performed public ministry.
Yeah.
The public ministry is the school.
Yeah.
The school of Tyrannus that's just mentioned.
The house to house is more the house fellowships.
Yeah,
Going to the different homes of believers
exactly.
and talking the faith with them, teaching.
So the contrast is, of course, Rutherford's too busy to participate in the work he says everybody must do. But in the New Testament, it's the leaders who do the public preaching, and it's never canvassing.
Because then you have to ask, like, why is it's the main guys, the leaders, that are being arrested, and not
And not the publisher.
prisons full of publishers of different disciples in the jails with them?
Quite
And they
so.
come and visit them because they weren't arrested.
In the next segment, a business-like approach, more about the development of Rutherford's policies in the area of public ministry.
Okay.